Hello and welcome to Page Turner. Today we're joined by none other than Barkha Dutt to discuss her new book, To Hell and Back, Humans of Covid. This is a book about the pandemic, about death, and about resilience in the face of it. It's so detailed, it's almost overwhelming to read. You've chronicled so many different kinds of stories. So my first question is, which one was your favorite and which one had the most debate around it?
So first, thank you for this conversation, for reading the book, for doing this interview. You know, it was really difficult for me to write this book. Like you said, there was so much detail sitting inside my head, and even then I had to leave some stories out because I just couldn't pack in everything that I'd seen over the course of 2 years reporting COVID. It's tough to pick a favorite when it's also bleak, it's also sad, it's also depressing. So the word maybe I'd use is the one that stays with me the most. And I think the one that stays with me the most is the story of, or the tragedy of this house painter called Mukesh Mandal. And he was a migrant worker from Bihar who lived and worked on the outskirts of Delhi. And when the lockdown was announced during the first wave, like so many others, millions of others, he lost immediately. He was a daily wager who got the odd job working on construction sites, painting walls and so on. And he lost his means of income. And he sold his mobile phone. And this, by the way, would be a pattern with so many people I met who were impoverished because they had no other assets. So the phone was the most immediate asset. So he sold his phone, he got 2,000 rupees and it was still hot. So he bought a table fan and he gave a few hundred rupees to his wife Poonam to buy some wheat and rice and dal, lentils. And the next day, he basically took her scarf, tied it to a bamboo pole on the outside of their little shanty home and took his life. And that really, really stays with me. It is obviously a kind of extreme expression of despair, but I'm just not able to shake that from my system. And I went back to his family a year later to see what had happened. And they lived in the same place, and his wife was looking for work, in the high-rise buildings around the shanty, and she hadn't been able to get one because nobody will let her enter these apartment complexes without an Aadhaar card, and she felt so helpless. She didn't even know how to get an Aadhaar card made and so on. And it's the one thing that just stays with me. It just doesn't leave me.
Mm-hmm. And his story is pretty early on in the book. There are so many more that come. One that really stuck with me was the story of Leelavati.
Yes.
And there's a moment where you break that barrier between being a reporter and a chronicler and a human being. And I wanted to ask, and you say that as well, that the line kind of gets really blurry. How did you maintain that separation?
You did ask me earlier and I didn't answer what generated the most debate. And I think that my own approach to journalism has never been that clinically detached. And, sometimes people have loved me for it, sometimes people have criticized me for it, but I tend to get emotionally consumed by what I'm reporting on. And COVID was, after the Kargil war, which I reported from the front line, the most transformative experience of my life. And the scale of tragedy, the scale of everyday despair, panic, fear, hope, heartbreak, resilience, tragedy, all of it, right? The lines blurred more than once. And Leelavati, just for your audience, was this old lady sitting outside the Bandra railway station in Mumbai, and she was sitting all alone weeping. And I'd gone to do a story on something else, on how the trains had finally started for migrant workers who till then had been walking home on foot. And I found this lady there just weeping, and basically it ended up being such that we discovered that she'd been abandoned and thrown out by her own children. And I think one of the invisible sort of dimensions of this pandemic has been what happened to the elderly, the loneliness of being old and the loneliness of those who did not have a support system or whose families abandoned them for one or the other reason, stigma, not enough money, and so on. And when she wept, and she held my hand and I just had to kind of reach out and hold her, And What was intriguing about Leelavati's story is that when we put it out on our platform, The Mojo Story, the overwhelming response to it, and I think I write in the book that it was almost as if she reminded all of us of our parents, of the subliminal guilt that we always carry, of how we could be better children but weren't.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, that, I mean, there are many that stay with me, and yes, Leelavati is also one.
Yeah. I mean, you can pick up on that while I was reading it, brought tears to my eyes because it was such a moving story. But this was also a personal tragedy for you. You wrote that you became the story that you were reporting. How was that process for you? Because like you said, people tend to attack you for putting yourself into the story. So how did that play out with COVID?
Let's start, before we talk about my father's death, about some of the things I get told on Twitter, or sometimes even by sections of my fraternity. Why do we need to know that when you were traveling, you had to create makeshift studios out of overturned buckets, or a little stool that I finally started carrying in sort of the dicky of my car? Why do we need to know that you had dongles for live streams? Why do we need to know all this? Why is this relevant? I don't agree. I do believe it's relevant. I do believe it's been very much part of the reporting process of this tragedy to set out like we did at the height of a lockdown, when there was no public transport, when the only way to get anywhere to anywhere was by road, when there was no place to stay, there was no food to eat. We were really dependent on the kindness of strangers. The logistics, they don't teach you this in some journalism schools, but they don't talk about this often enough in newsrooms. How to circumvent logistics is such a big part of actually being a journalist. When I was in Kargil, for example, there was no live broadcast in Jammu and Kashmir, nor were there any phones. There were no satellite vans. In any case, you don't report a war live, so there was no live coverage. But there was also no mechanism to send footage back. What I mean by that is that broadcast vans were not at the scene. Mobile phones were blocked in Jammu and Kashmir because of security reasons, and in any case, a war can't have live coverage. So one of the challenges became, we were still on tapes then, and that old, how do you send the footage back? So what would we do? We would walk kilometers looking for chopper pilots who were taking the coffins of our soldiers back home and beg them, can you please take the tape back? And later, when I told the story of how I reported Kargil, how that footage went back was a key part of that. Similarly, fast forward almost 2 decades, and we're a digital small startup. My platform is literally an infant when COVID breaks out. We're a team of 4. We set out. We are trying new technology for the first time, live streaming shows from like in the middle of absolutely nowhere, from the most remote parts of this country. And one of the things I wanted to say by speaking about, my makeshift studio, as I called it, is that I actually thought that I had become one of those TV journalists in my erstwhile life who'd got too stale in the comfort of the studio. And that if you started thinking of the studio as where people are, if you started thinking that a studio can be made from anything and anywhere in the field, that sense of rawness and authenticity will be much greater. So I found and I have always been like this, a kind of personal sharing. And I share what I feel with my audience, with my readers, my anger, my helplessness, my sadness, my exasperation behind the scenes. That's what BTS is. I see nothing wrong. I think it helps build a relationship with your audience, and how we use technology and the hardships and the logistical battles we faced were a key part of that. But sorry, you asked me about my dad. Look, it was a very overwhelming thing for me to become almost the exact thing that I had reported on with everybody else. So, I had reported on families desperate to find an ICU bed. I had reported on the problems with oxygen. I had reported on space running out at cremation grounds. With all my privilege, and I'm acutely aware of my privilege, I'm acutely aware that because I knew someone who knew someone, I was able to get my father an ICU bed, that I didn't have to sell things to pay the hospital bills like the people I was reporting on, who sold gold, who pawned family heirlooms, who gave up life savings just to pay hospital bills. But I actually think that I owe it to my audience that just as I have asked deeply intimate questions of people in their moment of loss, and mostly I have found that people have wanted their loved ones to be chronicled, to be counted, to not just disappear as mere numbers. I need to, however difficult I may find it at times, open myself up and share the same vulnerability that people have shared with me. And, I just think it was intrinsic and ironic what happened, and of course horrible for me personally. But it was part of what I had to tell. And in some ways, that shared community of storytelling, of exchanging experiences. So in the chapter on my father in the book, I talk about all the other daughters I met who had lost fathers, and how actually some of the conversations between us became about that feeling. And what really stays with me is there was this young teenage girl. Her father was a school teacher in Uttar Pradesh, and this was one among several hundred who died from COVID because they were forced into this sort of polling duty in panchayat elections. And this 15-year-old girl said to me, "You know how it feels because you lost your father." And it just broke my heart, and I had to say to her, "You know what? But my father wasn't forced into a duty that he didn't want to do. My father, I recognized overwhelmingly my own privilege at that point." So, look, criticism will always be there for anything you do that plays out in the public gaze, as will be applause. I think as a journalist, you have to be true to yourself, you have to be authentic to who you are, and that's the best we can all hope to do. And you have to hunker down, do your work, and not pay too much attention to the negative and not get too carried away by the adulation. That's how I've always been all my life, and that's how I am even now.
I'm so sorry for your loss, but
thank you.
Yeah, I can't imagine. The way that you've written it is so evocative. But actually, that brings me to my next question. In your journey as a reporter, Kargil and Covid were the two significant events that shaped your career. What changed in the interim? Is it the same Barkha Dutt?
It's such an interesting question because I keep getting asked whether this is a new Barkha Dutt. And I actually say that this is the old Barkha Dutt who had lost her way. So it's like a rediscovery of the old Barkha. Like, I remember being this sort of, wide-eyed reporter straight out of my first master's. I learned how to produce film and television. I used to make sound in the NDTV studio. And then when I did my first reporting, it was about some electricity breakdown in Delhi. And then I did the story of Bhavri Devi, the gang raped Dalit woman who was gang raped for trying to stop the marriage of a 1-year-old infant boy, and among the rapists was the father of that boy. And it was thanks to that case that we have the Vishakha guidelines, that a whole country of millions of us have. We owe it to this Dalit woman who was an Anganwadi worker in Rajasthan. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is why I became a journalist, when I did that story. And somewhere along the way, you get lazy, you get too comfortable, you get complacent, you become a studio rat, you get used to sitting behind the table every day and talking to the same folks. All of that happened to me. All of that happened to me. You lose a connection with your audience, you stop doing the things that matter to people, you get obsessed with getting the next big interview, you get obsessed with getting access to that big interview. I think in my COVID helped me realize my Mia Culpa moment, which is that I also just, I think, got lazy and stale. And I think this helped me rediscover the reporter in me, and that it also helped me rediscover how there's so much navel gazing sometimes that we're guilty of as journalists, that we get totally disconnected from what really matters to people.
Right. And not just as a journalist, you were also covering this as a media owner. What was that like? It was quite overwhelming, right? Like, think of us, like I had registered my platform in 2017 and then did nothing with it. Did nothing. Like I would post the odd video, do the odd event, and I was still dabbling with television, thinking of what I wanted to do. And towards the end of 2019 is when I was like, no, I'm going to be this digital multimedia storyteller. That's where that's where my future is going to be. And one after the other, things kept happening in the span of a few months. It started with the citizenship protests, and then the Delhi riots, and then COVID.
And I was, we're 13 people today. We were 4 people then. 4 people. That was it. We were 4 people. We were like little toddlers of the media world. Yes, I had been around forever, but the company was a toddler of the media world. And COVID happened. And you know what? It's been very, despite all the difficulties, it's been very uplifting because COVID provided a level playing. COVID was an equalizer for nothing except one thing, that if you had the passion and the will to go out and report, you had a level playing field with the big daddies of the media world to make an impact. And so as daunting and difficult as it was also probably the most fulfilled I have felt as a professional in years.
And you point to that very early on in the book, that COVID is supposed to be this great equalizer, but actually what it did was exacerbate the differences that exist between different sections of society. What were your coping mechanisms on the road? What were the things that you did to try and switch off or to separate?
Yeah, I don't know that I know how to switch off, and it's a problem. But I also did things, I remember I was talking to Rega Jha, a fellow journalist, and she said, what did you do at the end of the evening? And I said, in the beginning, we would still drive back to Delhi because we had no place to stay. And till we decided to just set out and find places to stay along the way, in farmhouses, in houses that belong to friends of friends, sometimes complete strangers. But I remember in the first few days, I would come back and grocery stores were still open. And I would do this strange thing of go out and buy Cadbury Nutties. And I would just buy boxes of Cadbury Nutties. And at one level, I would feel so superficial because here was this elite city slicker, you reporting on the poor and the desperate in the day and coming back and going to Defense Colony Market and buying those nutties. It was a capturing of all my elitism, all my privilege, and yet there was some manic need for sugar comfort. So, just small strange things like that. Watch the occasional binge watch at night where I couldn't sleep. I don't remember the last time I slept, binge watch the occasional some spy thriller on Netflix, whatever. Just that. Really no other coping mechanism. Like, I think I'm still dealing with all the ways in which this has damaged me and saddened me and depressed me and traumatized me and my team, right? It's been overwhelming. It's been overwhelming.
Was writing the book a sort of processing of that experience? Did it feel cathartic at all?
It did when it was done, but the process of it was extremely difficult. I collapsed in tears more than once. I got paralyzed. I called up Chicky, my editor, and said, I can't do the book. Let's just not do it. I had all of those things, and I never have that actually with my daily life as a reporter. I never say, let's just give up. But when I was writing this book, just revisiting everything, including not having my father, processing and internalizing that he was gone. There's such a sense of disbelief about it. Everything I'd seen, suddenly it all coming together. It was horribly difficult to write it. But once it was done, and I remember I told Chicky, I said, you know what, even if there isn't a single human being who reads this book other than you, it's owed to the people, each person that I met. Because if there's one thing that everybody wanted, it was, even in their most desperate moments, to talk about their father, their brother, their daughter, their sister, because everybody wants those they love to be acknowledged. And amid this raging debate over how many people have actually died from COVID, that becomes more imperative than ever, that you humanize this and you don't make it about numbers only.
Yeah, and the number of details that you've gone into in this book, the people that you've met, their names, their ages, where they live, what they do, it does exactly that. It puts a face. It does put a face to the humans of COVID in a way. And how did you keep track of all of that? Was there ever a certain point where you lost touch?
Yes. There were people. In fact, I feel terrible about that. There were people in particular that I sometimes met on the highways walking home, where I took down a phone number and then I lost that phone number. Maybe I, in a hurry, took it on a scrap of paper and then I lost that scrap of paper. And I desperately would try and find them because something about them stayed with me. I couldn't find everybody. I found a lot of people, but there were people I just lost along the way. Like there's so many, for example, that outside a Gurdwara where there was an oxygen langar, where there were these desperate families. It was the most surreal experience of my life. It was like a drive-through arcade for oxygen. So you had these cars driving through, desperate people at the back put on a mask, the cylinders were placed on the road, breathe for a bit and then move on. And the desperation I saw there, and I couldn't get everybody's phone number, and sometimes I couldn't find them and I lost them. But as many people as I could find, many people I called again, I did fresh interviews, I revisited. Right. But I couldn't find everybody, and I just felt like as many as I could, naming them was really important. Like I have tried for there to be no unnamed person in this book, right? Because they're not just numbers. And sometimes media critics say, oh, you people are so intrusive, you're going into cremation grounds, you're going into funeral grounds, and you're talking to people. Would you do that when your father had died? You know what? Maybe I'm a journalist and therefore I'm trained to be able to respond to that time, but I found overwhelmingly people wanted to talk. People felt so alone that they wanted to share. That sense of a community of mourners, a community of grieving people, but also sometimes a community of hopeful people. People still had dreams, people still had aspirations of joining the bureaucracy or joining the government or becoming a teacher, and hope hadn't died completely and people wanted to talk.
And it's a testament to that, because I hear this a lot as well, like there's something fundamentally extractive about approaching somebody in maybe the last moments of their life or at a time where they're being denied dignity. And the empathy comes through, the compassion comes through.
And I just, something came to my mind as you were saying this. I thought of a story I did on a husband who, it's not just us who's filming them, they're also filming themselves. So you had Manju dying in a hospital bed because the oxygen runs out, not from COVID, because the oxygen runs out. And you have a husband who's a municipal ward owner, Sher Singh, and he is filming her. So it's not, we are accused of being extractive. Just look at how important it is for them to document that detail. He's filming her and saying, ye meri begum hai, ye theek hone wali hai. Because in their minds, that documentation is important even to them. And actually, he shared that video. I never met his wife. When I met him, his wife had died. And he said, I want this video to be in your story. And a lot of families have got together to become support systems to each other. And what they have shared with me is how invisible they had started to feel. So there will always be this sort of academic debate over what is the exactly right appropriate tone? What is the exactly appropriate question that you can ask of a grieving family? And I don't know what the formula for it is. We can only try our best, and sometimes we'll sound tone deaf to ourselves, and sometimes we'll say a word we shouldn't have. And I'm not perfect. I'm sure I've asked the odd question that I shouldn't have asked, even with so much experience. But all in all, this is a debate, this is an intellectual debate which is very far removed from people who want their loved ones to be acknowledged, counted, talked about, written about, and spoken about.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the ground, was there a formula for the way that you approach people, or did you have any concerns about your personal safety?
It's two different questions. In the beginning, there was so much unknown about COVID that it felt like going into the great unknown, right? Just to give you a small example, you won't believe that in 2020, when we set out on our 30,000 kilometer journey from Delhi to Kerala, as it ended up being, more than 100 days, people didn't wear masks because the conventional knowledge at that time was that only frontline doctors in ICUs should wear masks, and we would wear these blue plastic gloves because there was some faulty assumption that the virus spread through surface, which turned out to be wrong. I'm saying that anybody who says in a dangerous or potentially dangerous situation that there's no fear, there's no apprehension, is not being truthful. What I say is that you deal with the fear by displacing it with something larger. You displace it with the challenge of, okay, how do I get the footage back? There's something larger than yourself. You displace it with the adrenaline, the challenge. You have to displace and dislocate the fear. The fear is always there subliminally, and you take as many informed precautions as you can, and then you do your work. There's nothing else that you can do. But you asked me, was there a set formula? No, the only thing I was very, very careful about is I would always ask, I never put a mic in front of somebody without saying, "Hum aapse baat kar sakte hain, can we talk to you?" If they said yes, then I would start the conversation. So that consent was extremely important to me, and 99% times people said yes. There were one or two moments when people said no, we don't want to talk, and then we just didn't talk to them. So other than that, the other thing was, things happened very quickly. So you had to capture moments as they were unfolding. Workers were not stopping to talk to you. They were in such a hurry to get home. We were literally, and they were so fit, they were so much fitter than me, we were literally panting to keep pace with these extraordinary men, women and children, often walking barefoot. So you had to be very quick-witted about how to capture the moment, how to capture the most powerful dimension of the moment, how to talk to people when, and try to not be insensitive. And as I said, none of us are perfect. I'm sure I went wrong in places. The only formula I had was, is it okay? Is it okay? And the only other really sort of precautionary thing was that we were allowed 3 or 4 times with the consent of hospitals into ICUs, where we never displayed we often devised a shooting mechanism where we shot feet and hands and never displayed a face, or we filmed, the drip or the injection or the medicines or the drugs, because we did not feel that that person was well enough to have an opinion on whether their consent was informed or not. So things like that. Consent was very important to me. So I was focused on that.
Right. And now, almost 2 years into the pandemic, how has your reporting changed on the pandemic? How has your approach to it changed?
Well, I think that the science of it has to be tracked in a dispassionate way. Yes, my book is about the humans of COVID, but as a journalist, at Columbia, where I studied at journalism school, the great lesson I learned was that you have to be able to take complex things and distill them into an accessible way. And I had this teacher who would say, "Write like you speak, only better." And the upshot of that lesson was, your research should be deep, but your telling should be simple. And your telling being simple cannot mean that your research is simple. So you need to go deep into it. And 2 years on, there's some distance from the emotion. Not from my personally I remain quite bruised after my dad, but professionally I do try to read every Lancet article that comes on a new development. What is long COVID? Is it hair loss? What's the role of steroids? Was ivermectin even a thing? Why was remdesivir prescribed? What does breakthrough infection mean? I've become a kind of geeky, obsessive COVID reporter. It's important. It's important. One of the things that I had again stopped doing in my journalism is to develop core expertise. Now, I'm not a science reporter. I am not a health reporter. I'm not a doctor. But because I have covered this issue so deeply, I do try to track every medical development in the way that I can on it. So there's a little bit more of the science now in the shows that I'm doing, less of the emotion and the people, because I think that's the stage of the pandemic we're in.
Well, on that note, I think that's a good note to wrap up our conversation. And I definitely do think you did tell these stories very, very clearly. So thank you for your work and your reportage on this book.
And thank you for reading the book and for taking the stories of these people to a wider audience. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.